Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and our topic for today is EVs and the electricity system. Our host for this webinar is Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA, and we also have two excellent guest speakers with us from the Rocky Mountain Institute and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Before I pass this over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for today's webinar are in listen-only mode. That means that you can hear us, hopefully, but we can't hear you. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console, you can click on the little orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also use that arrow to expand the webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar as you think of them by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will have a Q&A following our presentation, and we will get to as many audience questions as we can. And we do have a lot of people registered today, so that means probably a lot of questions. So to make sure that we get to your questions, type them in when you think of them. Don't wait until the very end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email probably this afternoon with a link to the webinar recording, and we'll also be posting that on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And that web address is a good place to visit also for information about upcoming webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, and that is Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Let me first tell you a few things about the Clean Energy States Alliance. If you're not familiar with us, we're a national organization composed of public agencies, mostly state agencies, and these agencies work together on group projects, information sharing, all aimed around advancing clean energy, especially in the electricity sector. And you could see on the screen logos of our various members across the country. So if we can go to the next slide, we can jump right into the webinar because I know we're going to have two excellent presentations, so there's no need to delay. This webinar today is focused on electric vehicles and the electricity system. Our nation is at the beginning of a transition away from gasoline-powered vehicles to electric vehicles. That means a lot for the transportation sector, but it also has significant implications for the electricity sector and the electricity system. If we make the transition well, it will bring down electricity costs. It will increase reliability. If we make the transition poorly, we're going to end up with increased cost, increased reliability problems, and less smooth functioning of the electricity system. Well, we have two speakers who've been looking at those sorts of questions, who have some very useful things to tell you. I'm going to introduce the first of the two speakers now, and then I'll introduce the second when it's his turn to speak. Our first speaker is going to be Matteo Muratori, who's a transportation and energy systems engineer at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. He leads and supports projects exploring new technology options and policies to promote the deployment of alternative fuel vehicles and related infrastructure. Before he was at NREL, he was the ExxonMobil Fellow at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and his interests include studying broad interactions of the transportation sector with other sectors of the economy, as well as understanding the role of transportation in long-term strategic scenarios. He's authored or co-authored over 50 peer review publications. So Matteo, you're on.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Warren, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Matteo Muratori. I'm an engineer here at the National Renewable Energy Lab. But before starting, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the lab. NREL, as we call it in short, is part of the Department of Energy complex of national laboratories, and we primarily focus on energy efficiency and renewable energy. So the lab works on a lot of different technologies, and in the transportation space, we do research on conventional vehicle, hydrogen biofuels, and a lot of other technologies. So my talk today will, however, focus solely on electric vehicles and their integration with the power system. And before I start, just as a disclaimer, I'm today sharing my opinion and my insights, and I'm not representing the Department of Energy or the U.S. government in any capacity. So whenever we talked about transportation issues, I like to give a little bit of a context. And what you see here is a chart that shows the source of energy use in the transportation sector over the past roughly 70 years. And when you look at this chart, what you see, we started by using a little bit of coal there in the 50s, but then the chart looks pretty boring. It's essentially a red chart, a big red slice, and that is the interesting fact of this chart being so boring. Today we rely on petroleum for over 92% of the energy used in the transportation sector, and this has been a fact for over a century in transportation. We have been reliant on petroleum, and petroleum has served us very well in providing mobility service, both for passenger and freight. However, what we're seeing today is that this energy landscape in transportation is changing very rapidly. I pasted here a few quotes to sort of give you a sense of what is happening. General Motors, for example, believes that the future will be all electric, and they announced that they're going to release 20 fully electrified models by 2023. Ford and many other automakers have invested billions of dollars in developing electrified vehicles. Tesla announced that they are going to expand their electric vehicle coverage to now include trucks as well. You see there, Toyota aims to get half of their global sales from EVs by 2025, which is only less than 6 years from now. So overall, in 2018, we have roughly 5.1 million electric vehicles on the road. This number increased by over 2 million compared to 2017. So you see this growth and this change that is rapidly happening in the transportation sector. And this is happening in the world and is happening in the United States as well. What you see here in this chart is the number of electric vehicles that are on the road that are sold every year in the United States. Overall, so far, we have more than 1 million EVs that have been sold in the U.S. and 360,000, actually a little bit over that, were sold just last year in 2018. So you see this big change happening in transportation, as Warren was mentioning at the beginning, where we are transitioning from systems that are powered by petroleum to a significant uptake of electrified vehicles. This revolution, if you will, in the transportation sector that is unprecedented in the United States is happening at a time in which the power sector is also undergoing profound changes. So traditionally, the power system has been based on the predicament that generation is dispatched to match power demand. You decide that you need to consume demand, you turn on your light or you use power to run some of your appliances or the lights in your office, and somewhere in the system a power plant ramps up their production so that they can provide that power to you. However, as distributed energy resources are being deployed, and I'm thinking about the distributed renewables that are non-dispatchable, energy storage, and all the communication layers that are being developed in the grid to enable demand and supply to communicate, this predicament is changing, and we are transitioning into a system in which demand and supply now talk to one another and work together to achieve a common objective. And so transportation electrification and this sort of revolution in the power grid are happening at the same time and are opening up for great opportunities to integrate these two systems that account for the majority of energy use in the United States combined together. and are really changing compared to what we have been used to in the past. So here at NREL, we really envision a future transportation system that can be optimally integrated with smart buildings, with the electric grid, with the renewables, and this system together can help us maximize our nation energy productivity and can help to achieve an economically competitive, secure, and sustainable future for the nation. In this context, here at the National Lab in our Transportation Center, we focus on trying to understand how this revolution might untie and might evolve over time. And in particular, today, I wanted to touch on a few points that we have spent time thinking about and working on and share some of the insights that we generated in our research. So we focus on trying to assess what are the electrification opportunities across different transportation segments, including light duty, but also medium and heavy duty vehicles. How do we think about these new technologies being adopted in the transportation sector and changing the way that passenger and freight are moved in the country? We have also generated scenarios to try to look at, how the rollout of different alternative fuel vehicles might play into the overall energy systems. And one aspect that really plays a big role in this is estimating the level of infrastructure that is required to support these vehicles. You can only drive in electric vehicles if you can charge an electric vehicle. And so how do we think about all those infrastructure needs that are required to enable people to charge and power their vehicles and then drive them around? I also want to touch quickly before ending today on the last two topics here. So how do we think about optimizing this power system, this new energy system, where we have, for example, high power charging stations for electric vehicles that need to be integrated with our power grid? And how do we think about designing those in an optimal way? And overall, what are the opportunities that are arising now as transportation system and grids start talking to one another and being integrated? So I'll touch a little bit on all these topics today. But before starting, I wanted to mention that all of our research here, all of the analysis that we perform is really based on data and on modeling tools and analysis tools that we develop and deploy to try and understand these issues and answer these questions. So I would encourage all the attendees interested in some of our more detailed studies to check out our models and tools that are generally publicly available, and so you can see them on our website, nrel.gov, and you can get free copies of the tools and of the data set that we generated, and you can use them to answer questions that we might not have thought of, or to enhance some of the studies that you are performing for your own companies. So the first topic that I want to start touching on is how do we think about electric vehicles in a future world, and how do we think about scenarios where electric vehicles might play a big role in the power system? So to try and answer this question, we kicked off a series of studies that are called Electrification Future Study. And here what we really try to do is try to understand what a world in which electrification achieves widespread outreach in all the sectors looks like. And so how would demand for electricity change if all our end users, including building industry and transportation systems, would rely on electricity rather than other fuels? And then, in turn, how would the U.S. electricity system need to transform to support this level of electrification? So today, I'm really going to focus on the transportation aspect of this. And so for this EFS study, the Electrification Future Study, we try to think of a future in which electrification achieves very high level of adoption across the entire transportation sector. And we try to estimate what the world looks like. And so here we have projection down to 2050, and we estimated up to 240 million light-duty vehicles becoming electric out of a fleet of roughly 280 million in 2050. And we're talking about 7 million of medium and heavy-duty trucks and 80,000 battery electric buses. So, however, together, this level of electrification and these services transitioning to electricity instead of relying on gasoline and diesel as they do today, leads to roughly 76%, so 3/4 roughly, of miles traveled on any road in the United States being traveled on electricity. One aspect that we think is important to understand is that when looking at these sort of future scenarios, it's really important to think of the different mobility needs that we have in the different services. You know, a light-duty car that is used in a urban environment and is driven for a limited amount of mileage has very different requirements from a Class 8 truck that is driven cross-country, for example. And so as we think about electrification and how it might play a role in different segments of the transportation sector, it's important to introduce all these nuances and try to understand where one powertrain like electrified vehicles might make sense and where it might be harder for these technologies to be adopted. And that's why you see all those charts here on the right-hand side of the slides. You know, the penetration of electrified vehicles is different in different segments because of these different mobility requirements that we try to respect in our modeling. So now let's look at what does this mean from the power sector. So as I was mentioning at the beginning, today, roughly 92% of energy used in transportation comes from petroleum. And the transportation sector, when it comes when we look at its role in terms of electricity consumption, accounts for only 0.2% of all the electricity usage. So 0.2% of the electricity that we produce today, or we produced last year in 2018 in the United States, was produced to satisfy transportation needs. In this scenario where we look at this widespread electrification, the picture radically changes. Here we reach almost a quarter, 23% of electricity usage in 2050 that goes to the transportation sector. So this is a radical transformation for the power system. You goes from a customer, if you will, that only purchases 0.2% of your output to a customer that purchases a quarter of your entire electricity production. And so what we're doing now in the EFS study is working on understanding what does that mean from a power system production perspective. How does the system need to change to accommodate this increased level of electricity demand? And if this is a topic that you're interested in, please keep our electrification futures study page monitored. We're going to release a report describing the implication for the power system by the end of the summer. And so we'll be happy to share it with you. The report will be freely available for anyone to download and to see our results. So changing gear a little bit here, I wanted to touch on another key aspect of electrification, which is the infrastructure. So as I said at the beginning, to enable electrification and the adoption of electrified vehicle, these vehicles need to be charged. And so we need to deploy a network of charging infrastructure to support these vehicles. The chart that you see here on this graph are a result of a study that we produced a couple of years ago. Was published in September 2017 by the Department of Energy, where we look at the national plug-in electric vehicle infrastructure requirements. So we looked at how many charging stations would be needed to satisfy different level of electric vehicle adoption, and how would this change given different assumptions about how electric vehicles are charged. What you see there on the right-hand side is what we call a typical electric vehicle charging load profiles, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the following slides. But one thing that I wanted to mention for this sort of infrastructure analysis is that, you know, there are really two dimensions to this report that I think are important. One is sort of giving an assessment of how many charging stations do we need to support vehicles. But the perhaps even more interesting result is how do these requirements for charging station change under different assumptions. And this is our sort of sensitivity analysis that you see here in the bottom of the slides. And some of the key points that we try to highlight here is that really the number of plugs, the stations that need to be deployed to support electric vehicles really change drastically depending on a lot of different dimensions that are surrounded by a high degree of uncertainty. So the range preference of vehicles play a very large role in determining how many plugs are needed. Of course, longer range vehicles will require fewer charging stations. And so there is a wide spread of results around that dimension. And another really important aspect to consider when thinking about infrastructure that are required for electric vehicle is whether this vehicle can be charged at home or not. That plays a very big difference in terms of how many public charging stations will need to be built to support a fleet of electric vehicles. So to facilitate communicating these results and enabling you all to take a look at what charging requirements in your area might look like, last year we released a simplified version of the model that we developed to perform those infrastructure analysis that's called EVI Pro, the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Projection Tool. So we released EVI Pro Lite, which is a freely available web-based tool where I screenshotted the homepage of the tool here for you to have an idea of what the tool looks like. But selecting a state or a particular city and determining input assumption for your particular area, the tool will help you gain insights on how many charging stations are needed to support a different level of adoption of electric vehicles in your areas. And so we really encourage everyone who has an interest in trying to understand how this infrastructure requirement might look like, what they might look like in your area, to check out the EVI Pro Lite, and please reach out to us if you have any question or clarification, but use the tool and use it as a starting point to gain a sense of what infrastructure requirements might exist in different areas of the country. So the last topic that I want to talk about is the integration of electric vehicles with the grid. So we have seen that today EVs play a very small role in the power system, but as this landscape rapidly changes, that might be significantly different in the future. And we talked about what infrastructure is required to enable that. Another important aspect is trying to understand how EVs are then going to be integrated with the grid. So when the power grid was designed, electric vehicles were not really an option. They were not around. And the power system was designed to reliably and safely operate and provide power to everyone. And so clearly now, as we introduce a new technology and a new source of demand, this is a great opportunity for utilities to expand their business and increase sales of electricity, but it's also a potential challenge to a system that was not designed to accommodate electric vehicles. So we started by looking at what happens if we add electric vehicles to the power system, and we do that in what we call a non-smart way, a non-coordinated fashion. If everyone would just use electric vehicles however they wanted without charging them in a smart way. And what we found is that there could be challenges, especially at the distribution level. So clustering effect in EV adoption, where more than one electric vehicle is adopted in a particular neighborhood and starts demanding power for charging, can increase the stress on these distribution networks that were not designed to accommodate electric vehicles. And so EV adoption really calls for properly assessing how EVs will be charged and how they might impact this distribution network, and really calls for trying to charge these electric vehicles in a smart way so that we can prevent these potentially negative effects. So to give you an idea of how different charging an electric vehicle in different ways might look like from a grid perspective, I wanted to show these two charts with you today. So what you see on the left-hand side is what the EV charging load profile looks like if vehicles charge primarily at home. What you see is that sort of big peak in the power demand there, primarily driven by that orange area there and the blue area underlying, which is the home charging. You know, when people return home after their daily driving and their commute from work, they plug in their vehicles and the vehicles start charging, and you create that sort of peak late in the evening, late in the afternoon and early in the evening, which is really similar to what happens in general to residential power profile. You know, you return home and you start cooking and you turn on your air conditioner and your lights, and you have that peak in power demand. However, electric vehicles are intrinsically very flexible. We could charge electric vehicles in different locations, and we can charge electric vehicles at different times, given the right incentive. So what you see here on the right-hand side is a chart that shows the charging load profiles for the same identical vehicles that we considered in the chart in the left. So same fleet, same driving behavior, no difference from a mobility perspective. Every vehicle is driven in the exact same way, but we assume that vehicles cannot charge at home. They do not have access to a home charger, and so they will need to be charged at different locations. In this case, workplace charging and public charging really pick up all that charging load that was before being provided at home. And so the key message here is that when you look at these charging load profiles, they look completely different. And what this means is that the impact of electric vehicles on the grid really can significantly differ depending on how electric vehicles are charged, where you decide to charge, and at what time of the day you decide to charge these vehicles. This really calls for leveraging this flexibility. So electric vehicles provide intrinsically this flexibility, and we need to design a system and mechanism so that that flexibility can be leveraged, and we can charge this electric vehicle in a smart way so that they can provide a service to the grid rather than pose challenges or introduce more complexities. And so the idea of a lot of the research that we are doing at the lab and that a lot of other research institutions and universities are doing around the world is to develop and design the most effective and optimal ways of charging electric vehicles so that these vehicles provide grid services and provide an additional benefit to the grid and are a sort of a positive technology that helps sort of co-optimize this new integrated transportation grid system. And there are great opportunities to do that. One of the examples that we looked at from a more practical perspective is DC fast charging stations. Those are stations that operate at over 50 kilowatt of power, where vehicles, electric vehicles, are charged very rapidly so that they can regain range and go back on the road as quickly as possible. So one of the issues with these DC fast charging station is that for those of you familiar with the electricity world and rate structure, they are often subjected to demand charges. So they pay a fee to the electric utilities that is proportional to their peak power consumption. And so given that these technology are high power, this fee might become high. And so we explore opportunities to reduce those costs that are related to demand charges and low utilization of these stations by using technologies. And what we showed in this paper here is that we can use batteries to really mitigate the challenges of integrating these DC fast charging stations into the grid and provide cheaper electricity for mobility services while at the same time also integrating and provide these services to the grid. So overall, the idea is that we can find smart technological and market solutions to better integrate electric vehicle in a smart way and co-optimize our entire system. So to conclude today, I would like you to leave with really a few key ideas from what we're doing and what we have found here at the National Renewable Energy Lab. So the first one is that vehicle electrification is really rapidly changing the transportation landscape, and we really need to push forward with advanced modeling tools to explore what the future is going to look like and design the future in the optimal way. Integrating demand and supply from the power system and integrating electric vehicle with the system can provide benefits to both transportation and mobility systems as well as the power system, really leading to an optimized system that provides cheaper electricity and reliable electricity for a lot of different end uses, including transportation, while at the same time supporting the operation of the power system and optimizing this integrated system. So I thank you for your attention today. I look forward to your questions, and I'm putting here some references. All of the work that I presented today is a result of teamwork of researchers here at the lab, and so too many to name here on the call, but I really acknowledge all my collaborators, and I encourage you to take a look at all our references, all the models and the tools that we made available online, and please reach out to us if you have questions or suggestions, or if you just want to discuss about some of these topics.
Hey, thanks very much, Matteo. That was really good. We're going to have a second excellent presentation coming up, and this one will be by Chris Nelder. And Chris is a manager in the mobility practice at the Rocky Mountain Institute, where he heads the EV grid integration team. He's written about energy and investing for more than a decade. He's the author of 2 books on energy and investing, as well as more than 200 energy-related articles and publications such as Nature, Scientific American, The Atlantic, and the Financial Times. In his spare time, he hosts the Energy Transition Show podcast, and he's going to pick up on some of the things we've just been hearing about from Matteo and giving a special attention to the issue of EV charging infrastructure. So, Chris, you're on.
Thanks very much, Warren. Yeah, so as Warren indicated, I'm going to basically just sort of elaborate a bit, add a little color to the foundation that Matteo has helpfully laid down here. First, I want to give you just a quick look at a couple of our major reports on EV grid integration over the last couple of years. These are all free and downloadable from our website. The first talks about how electric vehicles can be used as distributed assets on the grid by, as Matteo indicated, moving essentially the load of charging in time and space to provide benefits to the grid. The second report here for EVgo really focused in on the demand charge issue that he mentioned. And the third report there from Gas to Grid really explores the different context of different states in terms of how that creates an opportunity or doesn't create an opportunity to operate charging networks. Briefly, I just want to show you what my team is doing. We're in the middle of a long-term engagement with the New York Power Authority, helping them develop their transportation electrification strategy. We're helping them plan out a network of about 200 sites with 150 kilowatts, so there's a very high-speed DC fast chargers for light-duty vehicles. We're advising them on the demand charge problem and on how utilities can invest in the Make Ready, it's called, the grid support for charging stations. And we're also helping them develop now a charging as a service for the New York Transit authorities that are operating the transit buses. We also just finished a report for Seattle City Light. You can find that on our website, rmi.org/SCL, where we tried to help them understand what private networks are likely to do in their footprint, companies like EVgo and Electrify America, and then where are the gaps that need to be filled and how can Seattle City Light focus its efforts on addressing those gaps. And one of the things that popped out from that is that they really needed to focus in on medium and heavy duty electric vehicles, buses, delivery trucks, heavy duty trucks, and the kind of things that serve the major port there in Seattle. And to really be able to see when that load is coming onto their system and plan for it. We're also currently advising the government of Bermuda as they're transitioning their fleet of old diesel buses to electric and helping them understand, the implications of that for their local utility and how we can beef up renewable power on that grid to run those new buses. Of course, rate design and demand charges come into play here again. And then for various other utilities and municipalities, we're just sort of helping them understand how to proceed with transportation electrification, helping out on many of the same issues that we've just mentioned here, and really just make sure that they're ready to accommodate EVs on their grids. Just to kind of reinforce how quickly this stuff is happening, here's a chart from Bloomberg showing recent cost decline curves for electric vehicles, which are overwhelmingly, the cost reductions are overwhelmingly driven by that bit at the top, the battery cost. In Bloomberg's estimation, by 2023, so literally just sort of right around the corner, we're going to see electric vehicles be cheaper than internal combustion engines on a sticker price basis. Which is really what most individuals think about, which car just costs more if you have to buy it off the lot. Fleet managers, however, look at the total cost of ownership, and fleet managers are now well aware of the fact that even though an EV may cost more on a sticker price basis, it's cheaper to own over the long term on a total cost of ownership basis. What this basically means is that we should expect a rapid increase in EV adoption as we approach 2023, and people realize how economically advantageous it is to have an EV over an internal combustion vehicle. So here's a quick forecast on actual adoption. Matteo showed you a chart that showed sales. This is actually showing you cumulative vehicles deployed. And you can see we're entering a pretty quick adoption phase here where, we're going from 1 million vehicles last year to 3 million by 2022. And this is going to bring a significant amount of load onto the system and could represent over, $1.5 billion in annual electricity sales. So it's highly relevant to utilities. However, most communities are not ready for such a rapid adoption. Bloomberg New Energy Finance has warned that a lack of charging stations will effectively impose what they call an infrastructure cap on EV adoption, that people will just not see enough charging stations out there to make them comfortable with buying an EV. So we need to start thinking about how we're going to grapple with this rapid change coming at us. What kind of chargers are we need? Where do they need to be? Who's going to own them? How are utilities going to be able to support them and recover the costs of supporting them? How are we going to create a profitable business opportunity for charging network operators to own and deploy these stations? And how much of those costs should be socialized? In order to answer some of these questions, we reviewed about 150 pieces of literature on EV grid integration for our last report, the one titled From Gas to Grid. And this is a summary chart showing what we found on cost and benefit analysis. We summarized here about 12 reports that specifically looked at the costs and benefits of vehicle electrification. And we categorized those benefits across these different categories here. And as you can see, it's overwhelmingly positive. There's really no need, in our view, to do any more cost-benefit analysis. It's abundantly clear that EVs are a net benefit on multiple levels. Of course, if you're doing a utility proceeding, you do always have to generate a cost-benefit analysis for the most part, which is fine. But for policymakers, I think this is the important thing to keep in mind, is that there's really no doubt that this is a good thing. So I want to focus in briefly just to sort of explain and highlight again the important differences between level 2 chargers and these DC fast chargers. Level 2 chargers is the kind of thing that you might put in a workplace parking lot or even at home. They're inexpensive. They'll probably cost you up to $1,500 installed. And that's, these are appropriate where you have a vehicle that can stay plugged in for hours at a time. And they're going to deliver typically between 7 and 19 kilowatts of power. And they're useful for all sorts of applications. Whereas if you look over at the DC fast chargers, this is a whole nother beast. You're starting at 50 kilowatts of power. Most of the charging stations being built today are actually 150 kilowatts. There are places in the US and increasingly in Europe where 350 kilowatts is more like the power rating that you're looking at. So you can see that we're going to much, much faster charging stations. And these are also much more expensive. A decent rule of thumb is a DC fast charger is going to cost you about $1,000 a kilowatt. So if you have a 150 kilowatt system, it's probably going to be about $150,000 installed. And the important thing to realize here is that when you're fast charging, you don't have those hours of dwell time. You don't have the vehicle sitting there connected to the charger, ready to turn on or turn off or ramp up or ramp down its demand, which means that it can't really provide that managed charging service that a level 2 or a slower charger could provide. And that's really important from a grid management standpoint, and when you think about how we're going to manage the load on the electricity system. So here's a quick look at what managed charging really might look like. So here's the typical duck curve, which you may have heard about from In the California context, this is actually the duck curve on the Hawaiian Electric Company system. You can see there's that big dip of electricity demand in the middle of the day. And then there's this big ramp up that starts, sort of around 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And if we just lay some EV charging on top of that in an uncontrolled way, this chart would represent what would that EV load look like if 23% of the vehicles on the road were EVs. You can see that it actually makes that ramp in the afternoon even worse and kind of creates a higher peak. Whereas if we were to deliberately shift the charging of those vehicles into the valleys of the load profile, steer it toward the middle of the day and keep them away from the peak, we're actually flattening the overall load profile. And that has a number of benefits to the electricity system, which ultimately can drive down costs for all ratepayers, for all electricity customers, even those who don't have vehicles. Because it basically allows you to optimize the use of the existing grid infrastructure and not have to build so much peaking capacity to meet that afternoon ramp. Managed charging, therefore, can deliver some of these benefits. And here again, we're just talking G to V. We're just talking about turning chargers on and off. We're not talking about using vehicles to supply energy back to the grid, known as V2G. As I just mentioned, it can optimize your existing grid assets, help you avoid having to make new investments in grid infrastructure just to support the new EV load. It can allow you to manage the quality of power across the grid in an inexpensive way. It can also allow you to absorb more wind and solar onto your utility grid than you might otherwise be able to, because you can steer the load of those EVs into the same hours when the wind and solar production is really high. And that ultimately, obviously, allows you to reduce the total emissions, not just on the grid side, but on the transportation side, and reduce your petroleum consumption. But again, this is only really something you can easily do with slower level 2 chargers. And there's a couple different ways that can work. If you're a driver or a fleet manager, you can actually program your vehicle or your charger to charge at certain times. Hopefully the utility is actually going to give you what's called a time of use rate that will give you a cheaper period of the day in which to charge, and you can program your vehicle to charge during those hours. There are also companies like eMotorworks that basically can control the charging of thousands of vehicles at once, known as an aggregator. And they can do that in response to price signals on the wholesale market, which is an important distinction, a little bit geeky, but they bid into the wholesale market, not the retail distribution level market. Or you can let a utility control charges directly in accordance with grid conditions, and there's different ways of doing that where, the customer can set limits on how far down the charge can go, or, how much control they want to give the utility or over what circumstances. But anyway, there are a number of different ways of controlling the charging of vehicles, including reacting to demand response signals from the utility. So if you had a peak power alert on your system and the utility is saying, hey, this is a really congested time on our grid, or this is a time when power is very expensive to produce. If everybody could just turn down their load a little bit, that would be great. You can use electric vehicles to do that if they're sitting there plugged in to a level 2 charger and they can just ramp down. But again, that's not really the same use case as a DC fast charger, where the whole idea is to just plug in and get as much of a charge right now as you can. I want to take just a minute to talk about the demand charge issue that Matteo raised. This really is an important one. If you look at this chart here, this is an analysis that we did of what demand charges look like on a utility bill in both an urban and corridor setting for 5 different states. And if you see that big blue bar at the bottom of each one of these stacks, that's your demand charge. It can be up to 80 or 90% of a bill, in addition to the actual energy charges. And the important takeaway about that is that it really kills the business case for owning and operating private charging networks or charging networks operated by private sector companies. So in other words, there's no profit motive here. There's no business case for private sector companies to own and operate charging stations where you have this demand charge problem, which would imply that, well, if a private sector company can't do it, who can? It's probably the utility. But that's not always the answer that some communities or regulators want to see. They really want to see private sector companies investing in these networks. But if that's what we want to see, the important takeaway from this chart is you got to create a profit opportunity to do that, and that involves reducing demand charges. This is particularly a problem at low utilization rates, which is what we have now, where most charging stations are only in use, 2, 3, 5% of the time. When we get charging stations that are in use like 30% of the time, this problem probably goes away. But we have to get over that gap between this early stage market that we're in now and the point where a significant number of vehicles on the road are EVs and are able to deliver higher utilization demand on these charging stations. So for those who are interested in the utility space, we've done a lot of consultation with utilities and regulators around the country on this demand charge issue and on generally what rate design for EVs should look like. I don't want to go too deep on this, but I do want to introduce the topic. As I was saying, charging should be profitable. If you want to have private sector investment, that's what you got to have. But demand charges currently make that impossible in many cases. Also, I think rates should be designed so that charging a vehicle is cheaper than gasoline. That's easily done on a level 2 charger, not so much on a DC fast charger. EV chargers should be on dedicated tariffs and potentially on separate meters, but there's actually no reason you can't use the meter that's built into the EV charging station itself, but that can be a matter for regulators to address. Also, tariffs should offer an opportunity to earn credit or some kind of compensation for being a managed charging resource, for being able to ramp down or ramp up or provide a demand response through managed charging. And ultimately, utilities should be able to use things like the DERMS process in California to get a hold of hosting capacity maps to understand where on a utility grid it's expensive or cheap to add a charging station where there's plenty of extra capacity on that grid. And that's another thing that utilities and regulators really should be thinking about. How can we reduce the cost of deploying these charging networks is really the key question here. So I think this is my last slide. Good integration. If you do it well, if you create a profit motive for charging networks and appropriate tariffs from the utility that provide a time of use price signal for what are the good or bad hours of the day to be charging, and you really try to manage that load on your system, you can reduce the cost of electricity for everyone and reduce transportation costs at the same time. You can reduce oil consumption and obviously emissions. You can optimize the use of your existing grid assets and minimize the need for new investment to support electric vehicles. You can provide services to grid operators, bring more wind and solar onto your system, and actually provide multiplier benefits because the money that's being spent on utilities tends to circulate around within the economy a little more. And that ultimately also helps you improve energy security because obviously we're in this world less reliant on imported oil or foreign companies more generally. Obviously, if you don't try to prepare for this stuff, if you don't think about how you're going to manage charging, if you don't provide appropriate price signals through the utility tariff, and you don't plan for mechanisms and techniques to do managed charging, you get pretty much the opposite of all of that. You get load that's increasing the peak on the system, which requires you to build more generation capacity that's going to be very expensive because it only runs a few hours a day. That would probably be gas-fired capacity. So you're going to actually have less renewables, more emissions. You're going to have a less optimized grid that's going to be more expensive to run. That's going to increase prices for all ratepayers on a grid that's essentially less efficient, less stable, less reliable, and less compatible with more renewable power. So with that, I think I'll wrap it up.
Hey, thanks very much, Chris. Well, you clearly pointed out that the stakes are high here and we got to try to get this right. There are a number of questions for both of you. And the first one I want to ask of Matteo, and this had to do with the fact of you suggesting that 138,000 charging stations would be needed in your high scenario. And this person pointed out that's pretty much close to the number of convenience stores in the country today. And they're asking, are those number of charging stations needed to accommodate the fueling behavior people exhibit today? Or would fewer charging stations be needed in the future as society learns to fuel in a different pattern to meet the new system?
Yes, very interesting question. So in the study, I guess the number that the question refers to is these 138,000 DC fast charging stations that are required to support these over 240 million light-duty plug-in electric vehicles. So a couple of caveats there. When we say stations there, it's intended in the same meaning as you think of a gasoline station. And so each station might have multiple plugs. And so the total number of plugs is almost 500,000. So there is a big difference there when you talk about stations or plugs. And to answer the question, yes, the assumption for this estimate is that people are going to keep driving in a way that is consistent with the way that they're driving today. So one of the key assumptions in all our infrastructure studies is that we try to estimate the level of infrastructure that is required to enable mobility as we know it today. So if people behaved and drove the same way that they drive today, what infrastructure is required to enable doing that with an electric vehicle?
Okay, thank you. And Chris, one of our listeners has asked, you set out the difference between a good system and a bad system, and you pointed out where we need to go. What are some policy recommendations for helping states and utilities and the country move in the right direction?
Well, the first thing I think is to have appropriate tariffs available from the utility. Time of use tariffs are a good idea. Tariffs that depress the role of demand charges are a good idea. Tariffs that provide stable price signals that make it possible for either a fleet manager or a transit bus fleet manager or even an operator of private charging stations to predict their costs. Part of the problem with demand charges or also other elements on a tariff like a critical peak pricing adder can make the cost of operating charging networks very unpredictable and make it difficult for fleet managers to proceed with transportation electrification. And here I would point to the new rate from PG&E directed at commercial vehicles, electric vehicles, as something that folks might want to look at. My team will also be doing a study on that over the next couple months for the Colorado State Energy Office, so you keep an eye out on that. Beyond rate design, I think it's important for utilities to be able to offer charging infrastructure right up to the pedestal for charging stations, just because it's easier for them to do that investment than for the private networks. And really, it's appropriate for them to do that. And I think it's also appropriate for them to recover the costs of doing that through the general rate base, provided that there's some sort of performance-based element to that incentive where we're making sure that whatever charging stations the utility is providing infrastructure to support are well used and frequently operated charging stations. Beyond that, there's a number of building and planning aspects that community leaders can take into account. New homes with garages should be equipped with basically the equivalent of a dryer outlet where a charging station could be installed. Apartment buildings that have private parking garages should also have some charging stations available to at least some of its parking spaces. and apartment buildings that don't have their own parking should have somewhere nearby where people who want to buy an EV can plug it in and leave it overnight. And there's a number of other elements to providing policy guidance, but I feel like I should leave it there for now.
Good. No, that's very helpful, and we may come back to a couple of things in a minute. But Matteo, this is following up on the previous question. Do you believe that automatic or self-driving cars would have a large impact on the EV charging profile? Is it likely to make a big difference or not?
Absolutely. So we have done several studies looking at the impact of automation on mobility in general, and particularly focusing on electric vehicles. And automation does make a very large impact. One of the sort of key predicaments of a society served by automated vehicles is that those vehicles are likely going to be a lot more expensive to purchase, and so we want to have them on the road for as much as possible. And so this vehicle will be driving a lot more than what we drive our current vehicles that mostly sit parked either at home or at work. We only drive our cars for a very small fraction of time. And so when we think about electrifying those autonomous vehicles, we are really talking about different charging requirements where we want a vehicle to be moving and to be on the road for as much as possible. And so the charging needs now become quite different. Now you have a vehicle that needs to be charged as quickly as possible and might need to be charged even multiple times a day. Or in general, a lot more than a personally owned vehicle. So in terms of grid impact and ability to provide services and flexibility, automation seems to sort of hinder those opportunities and sort of preclude a little bit that charging flexibility. On the other hand, a fleet of autonomous vehicles can be optimally controlled, and they can make optimal decision on where to charge and when during their day and during their schedule to charge. And so that opens up for sort of the other side of the coin, for more opportunities to leverage that fleet. So I think that remains a very interesting and challenging research topic for which I haven't seen yet a definitive answer, but it would surely make a big impact and a big difference that I don't think we fully understand yet.
Okay, Chris, what do you think are the challenges to using EVs as a power source for the grid and making them flexible? Do you think it's going to be hard or easy to get EV owners to be willing to let the power from the vehicles go back into the grid and do that at the time when the utility really needs the power?
Well, we've been hearing about vehicle to grid for about a decade now, and it still doesn't exist commercially, so obviously it's hard. I think there's just still a lot of impediments to getting V2G to any sort of commercial reality. It's still the case that many vehicle manufacturers, if you use your vehicle in a V2G fashion like that, will invalidate your warranty. There is a lack of appropriate hardware and control systems, software control systems and communication systems to even effectuate the possibility of doing V2G. I don't think we know very much about how using a vehicle's battery to basically act as a grid resource will degrade that battery, and whether or not the utility compensation to the owner of that vehicle will be appropriate for the amount of degradation they experience. There's still a lot of questions that we don't have good answers on yet. We don't have good data on yet because, again, it's not a commercial reality. I wouldn't rule it out that it'll become interesting at some point, but if you look at it from the other perspective of just what is going on there, it's a battery providing grid services to, that can be done with a stationary array, that can be done with a rack of Second Life EV batteries sitting in a building somewhere, just as easily as it can, even more easily actually, that can be done with plugged in electric vehicles. I think the jury's still out on whether or not there's really a solid value proposition there. but there is no question, based on our research, that G to V, just turning chargers on and off, does have a lot of value, does not increase the wear and tear on an electric vehicle battery, and provides many of the same grid services. About 90% of the value that you need through managed charging can be obtained through just turning chargers on and off. You don't actually need to provide power from a vehicle back to the grid.
Hey, that's a really good point, and I suspect that's something that many people were not aware of, and it's good that you emphasize that. Well, we have just 2 minutes left. I give 1 minute to each of you to say anything you wanted to say that you haven't had a chance to say yet. Matteo, do you have anything?
No, I think we covered the topic very well. I really want to leave people with this idea that as the power system and the transportation system are transforming and undergoing this revolution, all these opportunities to connect the two sectors are arising, and there is research that is needed to sort of understand how those interconnections might play out, and we are doing some of it, and Rocky Mountain Institute is doing some of it, and we also need sort of a big push on how to take all that research and bring that to the marketplace. And so involvement from industry is absolutely critical here to make sure that the future energy system is going to be more efficient, more reliable, more sustainable, and better for everyone.
Thank you. And Chris, do you have any famous last words?
Sure. I'll just go ahead and pitch our services here for, if you're involved with a utility or with a regulatory body of some type, or elected official, or even if you're just a fleet manager looking to electrify your fleet and you're looking for more guidance, we can help you. So reach out and let us know what you're looking for, and we can help you with fleet electrification, with transportation electrification strategy, with rate design advice, and a lot of other things.
Hey, great. Thanks very much. And thanks to both of you for 2 excellent presentations, and to all you folks on the phone and on your computer listening. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you'll join us for future webinars at the Clean Energy States Alliance. Bye now.
Thank you, Warren.
Everyone.